Alright, I learned from my last few videos that there's certain things I have to clear up at the very beginning of the video, mainly what I don't mean with the title of the video. So, I am not saying that I want competitive gaming to die out. Neither am I saying that if you truly enjoy playing competitive games, you're doing it wrong. And I am also not saying that if you really find it fun to play every game in the most optimal way possible, to stop doing that. What I do mean with the title is that over the years I got the impression that a lot of people started to feel like unless they play games with that competitive mindset, even if it's just a single player game, they're doing it wrong. I also noticed that a lot of people complain over certain game design decisions that I think are perfectly fine and fun because they're optimizing the fun out of these games. If you watched my very first video, this sentiment might sound familiar, and indeed, this video is basically a follow-up or an expansion of that first one, because I want to expand on what I said there, talk about more genres of games, and provide more examples. So, if you haven't watched the first video, I honestly can't recommend it, as the audio quality there isn't all that great. I mean, I'd appreciate it if you did go check it out, of course, but I can't really blame anyone if they can't stand to watch it. Besides, I'll just give a quick rundown of what I said and argued in that video here first, before moving on to further examples. So, with all of that out of the way, let's move on to the recap of my first video. Basically, what I wanted to argue in that video is that modern World of Warcraft is too hard, and conversely, Dark Souls is easy, even though its community acts like it's an incredibly difficult game. What I wanted to say by that is that in modern World of Warcraft, players can no longer tailor their characters how they want. Recently, that's gotten a bit better with the new talent system, but because of the way itemization and stats work in modern World of Warcraft, players are still very limited in how much they can tailor their own characters. The way these things have developed through WoW's history is, I posit, because of how players have started playing the game. Basically, acting like the only way to progress through raids and even dungeons is by having perfectly optimized builds. Anything less became unacceptable. It seems to me that game developers noticed that and leaned into it. Then, when classic World of Warcraft got released, the design philosophy of which is much different to that of modern WoWs, players with that mindset of having to have fully optimized builds all the time started engaging in very degenerative playstyles. Stuff like not playing the game because they wanted to save their buffs, or farming for gold all the time so that they could respec into the optimal build for each raid every time, and even during leveling they'd run the same dungeon time and time again just because that was the fastest, most optimal way of leveling. On the other hand, I decided to play chill, not care about doing things fast or doing all the raids in one night in 2 hours or whatever, and I actually had fun playing the game. Imagine that. Of course, I was lucky to find a community of players that had a similar mindset, and yet, despite all our suboptimal builds, we still managed to clear all the raids. So, in that video, I compare this mindset with that of the Dark Souls community, which is arguing that the game is incredibly difficult, and has a subsection of the community which says that unless you beat the game in some incredibly handicapped manner, usually without wearing any armor and only using a stick without leveling up, you aren't playing the game correctly, or some such nonsense. And I argue that the fact that the game can be done with such handicaps shows that A. The game is actually fundamentally easy. Punishing, yes, but easy. And B. That is actually a good thing. It is a good thing because it being easy allows you to tailor your character pretty much however you want. You don't need an optimal build to finish the game. It will make it easier, sure, and if you play a suboptimal build, you'll have to compensate for that with your mechanical skill, but you can do it. Whereas in games like modern World of Warcraft, you really can't go off meta, not by much. even if numbers-wise you can have some off meta talents or some suboptimal item pieces, the community won't let you do that. So, that was my point and what I want to argue for in this video more generally. If you don't have fun playing games anymore, it very well might be because you're taking them too competitively. Playing them optimally might trivialize their difficulty, take away from the immersion, or it might force you into playing them in a way that isn't fun for you. And if the game is made around having to be played optimally, don't be afraid to put it down. Remember, games are meant to be played for fun. That's a concept that I struggled with for a few years before WoW Classic got released. Also, don't be afraid to turn down the difficulty to try playing a game in a way that's more in line with what you enjoy, assuming that's an option. If it isn't, and the process of getting good isn't fun for you, then yeah, the game just might not be for you. One recent example of me having to do that is with Assassin's Creed Shadows, where I bumped the difficulty all the way up to Nightmare at the very beginning, since I got the game sometime after release, and I didn't realize that difficulty setting was added after the fact, and it is clearly meant for characters that already have some skill points, so I've been struggling on that difficulty for a few hours, not really enjoying the game at all, until I finally gave up, and I understand it did feel bad to do this, and lowered combat difficulty down to expert. I kept stealth difficulty on Nightmare, and even just doing that made the game so much more fun for me, it's hard to describe it. I'll probably bump the combat difficulty back up once I get more skill points and some better gear, but for now, I'm perfectly happy playing the game on those settings. Now, let me make this clear again. If you truly enjoy playing games on the highest difficulty settings, looking up all the optimal builds, or playing games competitively, which inherently means playing the meta, I'm not talking to you. You're already having fun. This is mainly for people who are playing games with this mentality and not really enjoying themselves. And I'm making this disclaimer here again because I now want to start talking about different genres for which I think what I'm saying would also apply. For example, real-time strategy games. I know, sounds weird, especially since, at least it seems to me like, people nowadays mainly play RTSs competitively online. Way back when, this used to be my favorite genre of video games, but after I also started playing them online and eventually realizing that there is a meta in them and you have to learn certain build orders, I started losing interest in them. I learned a few build orders for StarCraft 2 and Age of Empires 2. I kept playing those games competitively for a little while, like a year or maybe two, but after that I was done. I just don't like how you have to decide on a certain type of approach to a round within the first few minutes of the game. Either you want to go for this kind of rush or that kind of rush, or maybe a fast castle or whatever. Basically, if you've seen that Bobby Fischer interview on why he hates chess, that's how I started to feel about these games.
I hate chess. I know what chess is all about. It's all about memorization. It's all about prearrangement. Creativity is lower down on the list. It's ridiculous.
Back when I still really enjoyed playing Age of Empires in particular, the way I played it was much more immersive in a way. I didn't really play it online back then. At most, I played it with one of my friends on LAN against AI, and what we'd do is we'd build our cities trying to make them look fancy. Now, I did see a comment somewhere recently that said that they used to play like that online back in the day in these sort of role-playing matches, where the players agreed not to attack each other for a certain amount of time, so they could actually build their cities and have big battles after the treaty time expired. I obviously don't know how many people would enjoy playing real-time strategies like that anymore, but if you're feeling burnt out from playing the way you usually play them, or at the very least Age of Empires 2, maybe give this a shot. Of course, nowadays we have all the different city building games, and you could argue that if you want to play like that, just go play City Skylines or SimCity or whatever, but those games have no combat at all, and I imagine the people that resonate with what I'm talking about here want combat to be a part of the experience as well. So why not load up a game against AI at an easy setting and see if you find that a nice change of pace? I know there's also Cossacks, which has this Peace Treaty Timer as a full-on possible setting. But for me, personally, I never felt like I want to build a city in those games, even though stylistically, I think those games look much better. Anyway, just mentioning it here because I wouldn't be surprised if there are more games than just the Cossacks that offer something similar as a game option. And again, I know I'm repetitive with this disclaimer, but I got so many redundant comments on my last big video, I have to stress this again. This isn't to say real-time strategy games shouldn't be played competitively or optimally. I'm saying if you don't have fun with the game anymore, it might be because you're playing it in essentially the same way over and over again. Alright, on to the next example. Grand strategy games. Total War. Ah yes, Total War. Probably an even more divisive topic than modern versus classic World of Warcraft. It'll probably come as no surprise when I say that I prefer the older entries in this series, mainly Rome and Medieval 2. However, I don't think the newer titles are bad. They are different, but I can see why people like them. That said though, since Empire Total War, the series has been gutting features from the games which made them more and more streamlined, usually with the excuse to make the AI more competent. And I'll say it again, yes, I know players want to have a challenge when playing a game. I do too. I usually play games on harder difficulties, so I'm not saying here that Creative Assembly should not strive to make a better AI. I'm saying that in that pursuit, they gutted features like city population, which they recently brought back but only superficially. They reworked the general's traits and retainer system such that they're no longer immersive, you just select what you want your generals to have, which again means that players will go for the optimal builds for what they need a particular character to do, rather than have a character develop based on what they're doing and then strategize accordingly. If that character is no longer useful in the situation, bring in a different one, or make a new one and try to get him the skills and traits that are useful. You can no longer move troops around the map without a general, but you can recruit units directly at a general even if he's outside of town, so unit losses aren't even a big deal anymore. However, because they also introduced passive troop replenishment, losing full units actually hurts more than suffering casualties within a unit, as that passive replenishment doesn't cost anything and tends to be pretty fast, while recruiting full new units costs gold or whatever currency is used in a particular Total War game and takes at the very least one turn. Whereas in the older titles, you actually had to pay for replenishment and actually wait a turn in the city in which you were replenishing your units to get them back up. And probably my biggest gripe with the newer titles, really this has been going on ever since Empire, but got much worse with Rome 2, where they implemented the province system. You can no longer grow any city to its biggest size, and you can no longer build any and all buildings in any city. I know with the massive map sizes in these newer titles, especially Warhammer 3 with its immortal empires, conquering over 100 cities with walls would be such a pain, but I can't help but miss that old system where I could grow a village in the middle of bumfuck nowhere to a huge metropolis. It actually felt like time is progressing and civilization is growing. This is also related to population, though they did keep a growth bar in cities, so you can't upgrade cities and villages to their maximum size immediately, but it still goes, or at least it feels to me like it goes, much faster than it did with the population system. All of this to say, while I don't know which of these changes were made to help the AI not do stupid decisions, though I'm pretty sure forcing armies to be attached to a general was done with that in mind, they stripped away all of these features that made earlier titles more immersive and, in my opinion, more open-ended. Now, because you have to decide which buildings you will build in a city, you will obviously go for the best ones, which don't really change between province to province, at least not to my knowledge. I will admit, however, that I haven't played that much Warhammer or Three Kingdoms or really anything after Rome 2. but from what I've seen Legend of Total War play, it seems to me like there's a defined optimal building setup you want to have across the board. So, what I want to say with all of this is, players complain about AI in Total War all the time, and then these changes are made that I know I'm not the only one complaining about in the name of making the AI less dense. I don't know if that's a necessary trade-off. I'm not a programmer, but if it is, at what point does Total War stop being a grand strategy and it just becomes a strategy game? Like I said, I like building my cities and watching my country/empire grow in population and development, not just in size, and I feel like that has to be a part of what defines a grand strategy game. Diplomacy as well, which in earlier titles is famously bad, which is a huge shame, and that was one thing that I got really excited for in Three Kingdoms. It's just a shame that that particular title has a bunch of other things going on with it that I really don't like. So, with diplomacy being what it is, city development being gutted, character development being streamlined, at what point should Total War just abandon its grand campaign map and go all in on real-time battles? And I'm pretty sure there's going to be people saying that that should never happen because it's a crucial part of the Total War saga, which I absolutely agree with, which is why I am positing that maybe the goddamn AI isn't the only thing the developers should focus on. And yet again, yes, I know players want a challenge, but I also feel like the people that complain about the AI the most are also the players that have been playing these games for years, if not decades at this point. While for most gamers, like myself, who isn't really that good at the modern titles, the game is plenty difficult as it is. But with that being said, like I've been ranting about in this part, I can't really get into the modern titles regardless, so I can't say that I've had the time to really get good at them in the first place. So I'm not saying that these games are too difficult necessarily, I'm just saying that the way I see it, they've been streamlined because the loudest members of the community, the ones actually reviewing the game and making content on it, are the ones that know it best, know how to abuse the AI, and don't find it difficult anymore. So they want the AI to be more competent and don't necessarily care if the series loses one feature here and another there. And this brings me to the other example for grand strategy games, Paradox games, but Europa Universalis 4 in particular. From Paradox's grand strategy catalog, I really only played Europa Universalis 4, Crusader Kings 2, and a bit of Hearts of Iron 4. I did play some Victoria 2, Crusader Kings 3, Imperator Rome, and Stellaris, but I couldn't really get into any of these. Maybe I could get into Imperator Rome properly if it kept getting updated, but as it is, most of the countries there play the same, the main difference, from what I can tell, being if you start as a tribe or no. Anyway, if you hop on Reddit, it shouldn't take long to find a post asking for help with getting started in any of these games. Of course, it doesn't help that the in-game tutorials are pretty universally shit at release and completely useless after a few patches. But regardless, except for maybe Crusader Kings, these games have a steep learning curve. Now, like I said, because of their depth, I feel comfortable only talking about Europa Universalis 4 here. However, I have a feeling that a lot of what I will say here is transferable to other Paradox games as well. Let me also make it very clear, I try to avoid as much promotional material for video games as possible, so it's entirely possible that my fears for Europa Universalis 5 are unjustified. I am speculating on what is going to be purely based on what I'm reading online from other people that are talking about the promotional material. So yes, I won't be buying EU5 on release day anyway, and I'm guessing I won't buy it for at least 2 years after release regardless, judging by Paradox's recent releases and when they get good, assuming that it won't do what I'm afraid EU5 is going to do. But that is a moot point anyway, as I am only going to compare EU4 with what I assume EU5 is going to be like, to make my point about people optimizing the fun out of a game. So, like I alluded to just before, Europa Universalis 4 is incredibly difficult at first. It overwhelms the player with a bunch of systems and numbers, most of which impact something else as well, and the player will have no idea that something which sounds a bit obscure or rather ephemeral might actually have a pretty big impact on their entire country. For example, initially you might think that prestige is useless, like who gives a shit if other countries think we're pigs rolling in the mud, I'll just conquer them anyway. But when you learn that plus 10% morale from having 100 prestige is actually huge, you start valuing it much more. And when later you realize how much plus 50% improved relations actually is, you might finally start realizing that all those plus 1 yearly prestige bonuses aren't all that useless after all. There are a few such systems in the game, aside from all the different systems that are specific to either specific religions or even specific countries, so you can see how it would take a truly massive amount of time to learn all the intricacies of this game. For example, which countries can colonize without taking specific ideas that allow for that, which countries can grow more than others, which countries can use no infantry in their armies, hell, even things like which provinces are worth conquering early because there are certain events tied to those provinces, and so on and so on. There's a reason why there's even a loading screen hint that says not to be surprised if, even after 1,000 hours of playtime, you still learn something new. Now, you're probably wondering how the hell are people taking Europa Universalis 4 so competitively if it's got so much depth to it. Well, here I circle back to what I was talking about with regards to Total War games. I very much doubt that the vast majority of people playing EU4 share the sentiment that I keep seeing spread online, mainly on the EU4 and now EU5 subreddit, and that sentiment being that it should be borderline, if not downright, impossible to do a world conquest in EU5, because they, that is to say, the person who makes such a post, can do a world conquest in EU4 by 1650 or maybe even 1550. Then they explain how they can achieve such a feat, and it will almost certainly involve a bunch of exploits and degenerative gameplay, which was clearly not intended by the developers. I haven't done a world conquest yet, and I have just under 3,000 hours of game time in this godforsaken game. I will say I have had a few games where I'm pretty sure I could have done it, but I just couldn't be bothered with all the micromanagement that comes with that in the end. But even then, if I did do it, it would have been in the late 1700s or even early 1800s, which is basically the very end of the game. For those of you who don't know, the game starts in 1444, so completing a world conquest even by 1600 is very fast. The current world record, I believe, from what I can find, is 1469, but needless to say, that involves degenerative playstyle to a ridiculous degree. A person doing something like that is obviously irrelevant for my point here. And while I'm talking about this, I also don't think that you shouldn't speedrun if you are a speedrunner and you actually enjoy speedrunning games. No, my point simply is that I think where Europa Universalis 4 is right now, with its presumably final patch, is a very good spot. Since I haven't done a world conquest yet, you can imagine that I prefer playing tall, but I like having the option to not only play wide, but even attempt a world conquest. I believe that is the whole point of this game. Victoria seems to be more a game for playing tall and not conquering all the time, and I believe that has shown every time Paradox tried to make playing tall in EU4 more viable. They got massive backlash every time and had to walk back their changes, at least to some degree. The biggest example of that I can think of right now is when they tried to tie religion conversion to the then new state system. If I remember correctly, you couldn't convert provinces that weren't stated. So then I believe they changed religious ideas to allow for that, until finally they made it so that you can convert unstated provinces, also called territories, regardless, just slower. Then there's developing your provinces. To develop your provinces, that is, to make them more valuable, either in terms of how much money you get from them or how much manpower they provide, you just click a button. Sometimes you might even get an event that raises development in a province or maybe even a few provinces. Incredibly fascinating. Of course, you can also construct buildings in your provinces. The more development a province has, the more buildings you can construct in them. Incidentally, in the very early versions of the game, you couldn't even develop your provinces. That's how focused the game was on playing wide. But yeah, the game just isn't built for tall gameplay from the ground up, which is why, in spite of all the bad patches trying to force tall gameplay into this game, usually only by punishing wide gameplay rather than rewarding tall, I think the game is in a very good spot now for both wide and tall gameplay styles. Wide is probably still more engaging, but playing a German nation, forming Germany and not expanding much beyond those borders, or maybe at most conquering the rest of Europe that you need for your mission tree, sounds like a perfectly decent run for even a very experienced player. Assuming that, again, they don't abuse certain mechanics or engage in an otherwise degenerative gameplay. So, what concerns me with Europa Universalis 5 is that the developers will again, like I suspect has happened with Total War, listen to the loud minority that can complete these incredibly fast world conquests and say, well damn, we have to make wide gameplay even harder, and in that process sacrifice a bunch of systems that make EU4 as engaging as it is. At least as it is now. When I mentioned that patch that made religious conversion impossible in territories before, I didn't mention this, but I actually stopped playing the game for at least a year then, because even though I prefer playing tall and you might think that that change wouldn't affect me at all, since I would just make all my territory states anyway, it did affect me. Because now it suddenly felt like I will never be able to do a world conquest, not because I'm not good enough, but because the developers don't want me to. This isn't something that would bother me in a game like Victoria, which again is clearly a more tall-focused game anyway. Bear in mind I haven't played Victoria 3, I'm talking about Victoria 2 here, but I assume, like in Victoria 2, world conquest is borderline impossible in Victoria 3 as well. So please, if you are one of those EU4 players that can do a world conquest by 1600 or even pre-1600, realize that you are a member of a very small minority of players that has mastered this game in and out, and the game is actually not that easy. If you watched my first video, or like I said at the beginning of this video, I believe Dark Souls is actually a very easy game. I believe most games, at least against AI, are very easy. But EU4 is not one of them. Yes, it's not as hard as it seems at first glance when you're overwhelmed with information and numbers, but it's not easy. For all the shit that the AI gets in this game as well, and rightly so, it's still competent enough to beat you. Maybe not in one war, maybe not even conquer you fully, but I have had many runs in which I couldn't get the achievement I was going for because I had a bad start that I just couldn't recover from fast enough. While I don't know how many people feel this way, but judging by the number of active players still playing this game compared to throughout the game's history, I have to imagine most players still have fun and feel challenged playing the game. So maybe try doing that Germany playthrough that I mentioned, or recently I've seen videos popping on my YouTube feed talking about why playing in Australia or New Zealand isn't that bad after all. And if nothing else, if you can do a world conquest so fast, I assume you have all the achievements in the game. Congratulations! But maybe you are actually just done with it. So wait for Europa Universalis 5, and who knows, maybe that game will still accommodate world conquests, but they won't be as easy as you fear, because it won't be possible to do the exploits that you're used to. Now, despite everything that I just said, I will finish this by saying that if the developers truly want to make world conquests impossible in EU5 and make it so that countries develop and expand much more in line with their historical paths and borders, fine. I don't think that's a good idea, but you know what? Not all games have to be made for me. In fact, I recognize that most games aren't made for me, and that is fine. I'm not complaining that world conquest is impossible in Victoria 2. Yes, I know it's been done, but in that game it's clearly not intended to be done, because that game is built to be played tall from the ground up. I don't expect to do a lot of conquests in that game, while I do expect that from EU4, and so I expect that to be possible in EU5 as well, but if it isn't, tough. I'm just not the target audience. I'll just stay in EU4. Crusader Kings 3 also made a few changes from CK2 that I dislike greatly and why I still can't get into CK3. I will almost certainly be giving it another try though after a few more DLCs, because much like how I can with newer Total War games, I recognize that it's not a bad game. But it just might not be for me, and I can always scratch that Crusader Kings itch with CK2. Okay, that's it for what I want to say in this video. I just want to address a few quick points in this closing segment. Mainly, why I didn't talk about more genres. Well, aside from RPGs and strategy games, I don't really play anything else. I'll play some FPSs occasionally, but again, in those games, when you play online, you will be playing competitively, so it's irrelevant to what I want to say here. Arma might be an exception, but I never played it, so I can't speak on it, and most of what I saw of that game was through Soviet Womble. The only thing I could say is, when playing through Call of Duty or Battlefield or whatever first-person shooters campaign you're playing, assuming the game lets you, slow down. The art in some of the scenes from FPS games can be incredible. So, take a while to appreciate it, take in the scenery. From my personal experience here, I have in mind mainly Destiny 2, which granted is online only, but you can play through the storyline on your own. Okay, then there's sports and racing games. Again, they're competitive by their very nature, and I don't play those genres anyway. Oh yes, and then there's turn-based strategy games. I did think about talking about Civilization, but then I realized I honestly don't have that many thoughts about it. I wanted to say that I miss being able to have a huge amount of cities like you could in Civilization 3, but I have played so little of Civilization 6 and I haven't even gotten Civilization 7 yet, so I don't know if anything that I would say is still relevant. But if I did talk about it, I would have tied that point to how the optimal way of playing Civilization 5, from what I remember, was to have 3 or 4 cities at most, while I really enjoyed that feeling of having a massive empire through a huge amount of cities. So yeah, that should be it. Thanks for watching and have a good day.